I'm Edward, and I'm thankful for this peaceful moment with you. Tonight, a special greeting to our listeners in Brisbane, Australia. Let us know where you're listening from, and have you ever attended a harvest festival? Tell us below what memories do you carry from those days, and subscribe if you enjoy these cosy mysteries. Now, settle in, and let us begin. Chapter 1. Apples Polished for the Altar. The first days of October had settled over St Mary Mead with that peculiar quality of light that seems to exist only in the English countryside, when the year has begun its gentle decline, but has not yet surrendered to the inevitability of winter. The hedgerows still held their greenness, though touched here and there with gold, and the gardens, those small kingdoms over which the villagers presided with varying degrees of success and pride, offered up their final bounty with an air of quiet satisfaction. It was the time of year when thoughts turn naturally to Thanksgiving, and in St Mary Mead, as in villages throughout the length and breadth of England, this meant the harvest festival. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary chair by the window of her pleasant sitting room, had been observing the preparations with that gentle attentiveness which had become so much a part of her nature that she was scarcely aware of it herself. Her knitting needles moved with their usual steady rhythm, creating order from wool much as her mind created understanding from the small details of village life that others so often overlooked. Through her window she had watched Mr Clement, the sexton, making his way to the church each morning with an increasingly purposeful stride. She had noted Mrs Price from the bakery carrying armfuls of wheat sheaves, their golden heads catching the autumn sunlight. She had observed young Dorothy Fletcher struggling with an enormous marrow from her father's allotment, pride and awkwardness mingling in equal measure on her fresh young face. The village, Miss Marple reflected, was in that state of pleasant bustle that precedes any communal celebration, when everyone has a role to play and takes satisfaction in playing it well. The kettle began to whistle in the kitchen, and Miss Marple set down her knitting to attend to it. She was expecting visitors that afternoon, as she was every Tuesday, for the small committee that oversaw the church's charitable distributions had fallen into the habit of meeting at her cottage. It was convenient, they all agreed, and Miss Marple made excellent tea. That the meetings happened to provide her with a comprehensive understanding of village affairs was a circumstance that occurred to some of the committee members rather later than it might have done. Mrs Emmeline Dacre was the first to arrive, as was her custom. She was a woman of perhaps 55, handsome in a somewhat austere fashion, with iron-grey hair arranged in rigid waves, and a manner that suggested she had long ago decided what the world should be, and was perpetually disappointed by its failure to comply. She had been widowed young, left comfortably provided for, and had dedicated herself to good works with the intensity of one who requires occupation to fill the spaces that might otherwise be occupied by reflection. "Such a pleasant afternoon, Miss Marple," she announced, settling herself on the sofa with the air of one taking possession of a strategic position. "The weather has been most obliging for our preparations. Providence, one might say, smiles upon our efforts." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, pouring tea with practised ease, "though I always think October weather has a mind of its own, whatever our plans might be." Mrs Dacre accepted her cup with a nod that suggested she was prepared to allow October its whims, provided they did not interfere with the harvest festival. The arrival of Miss Lavinia Hartley, the vicar's sister, and Mrs Agnes Rowell prevented any further meteorological speculation. Miss Hartley was a tall, thin woman with a vague, kindly manner, and a tendency to lose her train of thought mid-sentence, while Mrs Rowell was widely regarded as the gentlest soul in St Mary Mead, a small, round woman whose pink cheeks and soft voice seemed to radiate an instinctive benevolence. "I do hope I'm not late," Miss Hartley murmured, removing her gloves with the distracted air of one who has forgotten why she put them on in the first place. "My brother was consulting me about the hymns, and you know how he does worry over these things. He's settled on 'Come, ye thankful people, come naturally, and we plough the fields and scatter,' which I've always found rather stirring, though the ploughing verse does go on somewhat." "Most appropriate," Mrs Dacre pronounced. "Traditional selections are always to be preferred. Innovation in matters of worship leads only to confusion, and one might add a certain decline in standards. Mrs. Rowell, settling herself in the chair nearest the fire with a little sigh of contentment, smiled her gentle smile. "I'm sure the service will be lovely, whatever is chosen. Mr. Fenton has everything so beautifully organised as always. I don't know what we should do without him." The mention of Mr. Leonard Fenton brought murmurs of agreement from the assembled ladies. Miss Marple, offering the plate of her housekeeper's excellent shortbread, observed these murmurs with the same quiet attention she brought to all aspects of village life. Mr. Fenton had been handling the church accounts and the various charitable distributions associated with the Harvest Festival for more years than anyone cared to count precisely. He was a man of perhaps 60, slight of build, with thinning grey hair, and a manner so retiring that one could sit next to him for an hour and scarcely remember afterwards what he looked like. He lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of the village, kept a modest garden, and went about his duties with such quiet efficiency that the parish had long ago ceased to think about how the various administrative tasks were accomplished. They simply were, and Mr. Fenton, like the changing of the seasons, was accepted as one of those reliable certainties upon which village life depended. "He really is remarkably thorough," Miss Hartley observed, helping herself to shortbread. "My brother says the accounts are always absolutely pristine. Not a penny out of place, not a single detail overlooked. Such a relief, really, in these modern times when one hears such dreadful stories of muddle and confusion in parish matters." "Organisation is a virtue much underrated," Mrs. Dacre declared. "Mr. Fenton understands his place and fulfills it admirably. One asks for nothing more." Miss Marple, pouring more tea, made a small non-committal sound that might have been agreement. "I called on him yesterday," Mrs. Rowell said, her soft voice thoughtful, "just to confirm the final arrangements for the distribution baskets. He seemed quite well, though perhaps a little tired. I did suggest he might rest a bit before the festival day itself, but you know how he is. So dedicated to his duties." "Did he have everything prepared?" Mrs. Dacre inquired, with the briskness of one accustomed to ensuring that others had done what they ought to have done. "Oh, yes. Everything labelled and ready. He's prepared the distribution list exactly as we discussed last month. The usual families, of course, and the additions we agreed upon." Mrs. Rule paused, a small furrow appearing between her brows, though I must confess he did seem to have some small concern on his mind. Nothing he wished to discuss, I'm sure, but one could sense a certain preoccupation. "Probably ensuring every detail is perfect," Miss Hartley suggested. "Such a conscientious man." The conversation drifted then to other matters, to the question of whether the church should be decorated with chrysanthemums as well as the traditional harvest offerings, to Mrs. Price's planned contribution of specially baked loaves shaped like wheat sheaves, to the small rivalry between the gardeners over whose apples would shine most brightly on the altar steps. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving steadily, her expression placid. But she was thinking about Mr. Fenton, that quiet, reliable man whom everyone praised and no one particularly noticed. She was thinking about Mrs. Rowell's observation that he had seemed preoccupied, and about the curious fact that in all the years she had observed him, she could not recall him ever appearing preoccupied before. It was probably nothing, of course. The Harvest Festival was an important occasion, and even the most organised individuals might feel the weight of responsibility as the day approached. Still, Miss Marple had learned over her many years that it was often the small departures from pattern that proved most significant. A usually reliable person who seemed troubled, a usually contented person who appeared worried. These were the tiny irregularities that sometimes presaged larger disturbances in the smooth surface of village life. The committee meeting concluded with general satisfaction all around. The weather would hold, the decorations would be splendid, the service would be uplifting, and the subsequent distribution of harvest gifts to those in need would be accomplished with dignity and discretion, as it had been for generations. As her visitors departed, calling out their farewells and promising to see her at the church on Sunday morning, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The afternoon light was beginning to slant, turning the garden to gold, and somewhere in the distance a church bell was ringing for evensong. She picked up her knitting, her mind turning over the small details of the afternoon's conversation. There was something there. Some tiny, discordant note in the general harmony of preparation and anticipation. She could not have said precisely what it was, only that it existed, as surely as the autumn chill that was beginning to creep into the evening air. In her experience, villages were like gardens. Most of the time everything grew as it should, in its proper place and season. But occasionally something appeared that did not belong, or something that should have appeared failed to do so, and the careful observer, if she paid attention, might notice before anyone else that all was not quite as it seemed. Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably and continued with her knitting. Sunday would be the harvest festival, and she would attend as she always did, and watch as she always did, and notice what there was to be noticed. It was, after all, in the nature of things that harvest revealed not only what had grown, but what had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of apparently thriving soil. Chapter 2. A pew left unexpectedly empty. Sunday morning arrived with that peculiar clarity of light that sometimes graces an English autumn, as though the year, sensing its own decline, had determined to make one final brilliant effort before surrendering to November's grey embrace. The church bells of St. Mary Mead rang out across the village with their familiar summons, and the inhabitants, dressed in their Sunday best, made their way along the lanes and paths that converged upon the ancient building, whose spire had presided over generations of worship, celebration, and quiet sorrow. Miss Marple walked slowly, as befitted both her years and her habit of observation. She noted Mrs. Price from the bakery hurrying past with unusual haste, her hat slightly askew. She observed young Dorothy Fletcher walking with her parents, the girl's earlier pride in her marrow apparently vindicated by its prominent placement among the altar decorations. She saw Dr. Haydock striding along with his characteristic energy, his medical bag in hand as always, for doctors could never entirely abandon their professional readiness even on the Sabbath. The church itself had been transformed, as it was each year at this season, into a celebration of abundance. Wheat sheaves stood in golden profusion at the ends of the pews. Apples and pears, polished until they gleamed like jewels, lined the altar steps in careful pyramids. Marrows and potatoes, turnips and carrots, all the humble produce of the earth, had been arranged with considerable artistry along the windowsills. The effect was one of almost overwhelming plenty, a reassurance that the land had once again fulfilled its ancient promise, and that the community, through its labour and Providence's blessing, would not want through the darker months ahead. Miss Marple took her accustomed seat and allowed her gaze to travel over the congregation as it assembled. She had known most of these people all her life, had watched them grow from children to adults, had observed their marriages and mourned at their funerals, had noted their small triumphs and their quiet sorrows. To her they were as much a part of the landscape as the fields beyond the village or the eternal presence of the church itself. Mrs. Dacre entered with her usual air of assured purpose, and settled herself in the third pew with a small, satisfied nod at the decorations. Miss Hartley fluttered in shortly after, accompanied by her brother the vicar, who was already wearing the slightly harassed expression of one who must shortly perform before an audience. Mrs. Rowell appeared, pink-cheeked and smiling, and made her way to her seat near the front, where she could best hear the sermon despite her increasing deafness. The organ began its preliminary wheezing, and the congregation rose for the processional hymn. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the empty pew. Mr. Fenton's seat, 7 rows from the front on the left side, remained conspicuously unoccupied. This was unusual enough to be remarkable, for Mr. Fenton had occupied that particular pew every Sunday for as long as anyone could remember, arriving precisely 10 minutes before the service began and departing precisely 5 minutes after it concluded. He was as regular as the church clock and considerably more reliable. The service proceeded with its familiar rhythm. The Reverend Hartley, having conquered his nervousness, delivered a sermon on gratitude that was both heartfelt and mercifully brief. The congregation sang with more enthusiasm than musicality. The collection plates were passed, and Miss Marple observed, as she always did, who gave generously, who gave modestly, and who gave with the air of one bestowing a considerable favour upon the Almighty. But throughout it all, Mr. Fenton's pew remained empty, and Miss Marple found her attention returning to that absence more frequently than she attended to the service itself. It was not merely that he was absent. People did occasionally miss church due to illness or unavoidable circumstance. It was rather that his absence seemed somehow unfinished, as though he had intended to be present, but had been prevented at the last moment. Near the altar steps, among the carefully arranged harvest offerings, sat a basket that Miss Marple had not noticed initially. It was a handsome thing, woven from willow, and it contained an assortment of produce that suggested considerable thought in its selection. A small card attached to the handle bore Mr. Fenton's neat copperplate handwriting. The basket, unlike its donor, had arrived for the festival. The donor himself had not. After the final hymn and the vicar's blessing, the congregation filed out into the autumn sunshine with that particular relief that follows any communal obligation successfully completed. Groups formed naturally on the church path, conversations blooming like the chrysanthemums in the nearby gardens. The weather was remarked upon, the decorations praised, and the vicar's sermon gently dissected in the manner of people who had listened with only partial attention. Miss Marple, making her way slowly toward the gate, found herself beside Dr. Haydock, who had paused to examine one of the ancient yew trees with the absorbed interest of one who suspects it might be harbouring some botanical peculiarity. "A fine service," Miss Marple observed, in the tone of one making polite conversation. "Oh, yes, quite," Dr. Haydock replied absently, his attention still on the tree. Then, with the abruptness characteristic of medical men whose thoughts are often elsewhere, he added, "Odd about Fenton, though. Can't remember him ever missing before." "I noticed his absence," Miss Marple admitted. "Do you suppose he's unwell?" "Could be. Heart's not what it was, if you ask me, though he'd never consult me about it properly. Independent sort of fellow for all his quietness. Probably decided to rest rather than exert himself with all the festival preparations." "His basket arrived, however," Miss Marple pointed out gently. Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did it? Well, that's Fenton for you. Wouldn't want to disappoint even if he couldn't come himself. Probably arrange for someone to bring it." They were joined then by Mrs. Dacre, whose expression suggested she had something of importance to communicate. "Most irregular," she announced, her tone making clear that irregularity ranked high among the cardinal sins. "Mr. Fenton's absence, I mean, and on Harvest Festival Sunday of all days. One would have thought, given his responsibilities, that he might have made the effort." "Perhaps he's ill," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Then someone should have been informed. There are proper channels for these things. The vicar ought to have been notified, at the very least. It creates an awkward situation." Miss Marple thought, though she did not say, that Mrs. Dacre's concern seemed rather more focused on the awkwardness of the situation than on Mr. Fenton's well-being, but she merely nodded and murmured something appropriately sympathetic. The gathering on the church path began to disperse as the morning wore on toward luncheon. Miss Marple, declining an invitation from Miss Hartley to take sherry at the vicarage, made her way home through the quiet Sunday streets. But her mind, as her feet carried her along the familiar route, was occupied with the puzzle of Mr. Fenton's absence. It was Mrs. Rowell who brought the news, arriving at Miss Marple's cottage in the middle of the afternoon with her face flushed, and her usual serenity quite overset. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, sinking into the offered chair with none of her customary composure. "Such dreadful news? Mr. Fenton has been found, in his garden shed. Dr. Haydock has been, and he says it was his heart, that he must have died quite peacefully sometime yesterday evening, he thinks." Miss Marple set down her knitting very carefully. "How terrible," she said quietly. "The poor man. And all alone, too." "Yes, it's just awful to think of it." Mrs. Rule fumbled for her handkerchief, and on the eve of the Harvest Festival, when he'd worked so hard to prepare everything. His cottage was locked, you see. No one thought anything of it this morning, assumed he was simply sleeping late, or had decided not to attend. But when the afternoon came and he still hadn't appeared, and there were questions about the distribution arrangements, Dr. Haydock went round to check on him. Had to have the constable help get in through a window, and there they found him, in his shed, sitting quite peacefully in his chair, as though he'd simply dozed off. "A merciful end, at least," Miss Marple said, though her eyes were thoughtful. "Dr. Haydock is certain it was his heart." "Oh, yes, quite certain. He said Mr. Fenton's heart had been weak for years, though Mr. Fenton would never admit to it. A sudden failure, he called it. Said it could happen at any time, and that there was nothing to be done once it began. He died very quickly, Dr. Haydock thinks, and without suffering. That is some comfort, I suppose." Mrs. Rowell nodded, dabbing at her eyes. "I feel quite dreadful about it, Miss Marple. I was the last person to see him, you know, when I called on Friday evening. He seemed perfectly well then, though I did think him a bit tired. I suggested he rest, but you know how dedicated he was to his duties. And now, to think that he was lying there all through yesterday and last night, while we were all preparing for the festival." "You mustn't distress yourself," Miss Marple said gently. "There was nothing you could have done. If his heart was going to fail, it would have done so regardless of your visit or your advice." I know, but still, one can't help feeling that perhaps if I'd stayed longer, or insisted he call Dr. Haydock or something." Mrs. Rawle's voice trailed off into miserable uncertainty. Miss Marple poured tea and offered it with the understanding that hot, sweet tea was the prescribed remedy for shock, however inadequate it might seem in the face of death. As Mrs. Rowell gradually regained her composure and eventually departed to spread the sad news through the rest of the village, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The afternoon light was fading, and the garden beyond the glass was settling into evening's gentler shadows. A sudden failure of the heart. Dr. Haydock would know, of course. He was a competent physician, thorough in his methods and sound in his judgments. And yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by something she could not quite name. It was not suspicion, precisely. It was rather a sense that something was incomplete, that the pattern did not quite align as it should. A man who had never missed a church service suddenly failed to attend the most important service of the year, despite having prepared his contribution with his usual meticulous care. A man who had seemed preoccupied on Friday evening, according to Mrs. Rowell's account, and then dead in his shed by Saturday evening. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but her needles moved more slowly than usual. Outside, the shadows lengthened, and somewhere in the village, Mr. Fenton's empty cottage stood locked and silent, its secrets, if it had any, preserved behind closed doors and shuttered windows. The harvest festival had come, and the village had given thanks. But one member of the congregation had been absent from the thanksgiving, and Miss Marple could not quite rid herself of the feeling that his absence spoke more loudly than any presence could have done. Chapter 3. Thanks offered with uneven warmth. The days following Mr. Fenton's death unfolded with that peculiar quality of suspension that characterises a village in the immediate aftermath of unexpected loss. Life continued as it must, but with a certain muted quality, as though the community had collectively agreed to lower its voice out of respect for the departed. The weather, which had been so obligingly fine for the harvest festival, turned grey and drizzling, lending the landscape an appropriately sombre cast. Miss Marple, confined to her cottage by the persistent rain, occupied herself with her usual domestic pursuits, while her mind, as was its habit, turned over the various threads of the recent events. She received visitors, as she always did. In times of village upheaval, whether joyous or sorrowful, there seemed to be an unspoken understanding that Miss Marple's sitting-room served as a kind of informal clearing-house for news, speculation, and the general sorting out of communal sentiment. Miss Hartley arrived first on Tuesday afternoon, shaking the rain from her umbrella with the vague, distracted air that characterised all her movements. "Such dreary weather," she observed, settling herself with a sigh. "My brother says it's fitting given the circumstances, though I'm not entirely sure the weather pays much attention to our human concerns. Still, it does seem appropriate somehow." Miss Marple poured tea and waited, knowing from long experience that Miss Hartley would eventually arrive at whatever information she had come to share, though the route might be circuitous. "The funeral is to be on Thursday," Miss Hartley continued, accepting her cup. "A quiet affair, my brother thought best. After all, poor Mr. Fenton had no family to speak of, no particular friends that anyone knew of. Just the village, really, and his work for the church. Such a solitary life when one thinks about it, though I don't suppose he minded. Some people are quite content with their own company, aren't they? Though I've never understood it myself, I should be quite lost without conversation." "Mr. Fenton was certainly very reliable in his duties," Miss Marple said, guiding the conversation gently back toward firmer ground. "Oh, absolutely. My brother has been quite distressed about finding a replacement. The accounts, you see, and all the various charitable matters. Mr. Fenton had such a system, everything recorded in those neat ledgers of his. My brother says it will take weeks to sort through it all properly." Miss Hartley paused, a small furrow appearing on her brow. "Though one does wonder, doesn't one?" "Wonder what, dear?" Miss Marple prompted, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "Well, about gratitude, I suppose. Everyone is saying such kind things about Mr. Fenton now, about how dedicated he was, how indispensable, how we shall never find anyone quite so reliable, and I'm sure it's all perfectly true, but I can't help noticing that no one said these things to him while he was alive. At least not that I ever heard. We all simply expected him to manage everything, and took it quite for granted when he did." This observation, delivered in Miss Hartley's characteristically meandering fashion, struck Miss Marple as rather more perceptive than Miss Hartley's usual offerings. She looked at the vicar's sister with new interest. "That is often the way with those who perform their duties quietly," Miss Marple said. "We notice the absence more readily than we notice the presence." "Yes, exactly. And now everyone is falling over themselves to praise him, but it does seem rather late for that, doesn't it? Though I suppose one mustn't speak ill of the dead, or rather, one mustn't speak critically of how we speak of the dead." Miss Hartley looked confused by her own logic, and took refuge in her teacup. The following afternoon brought Mrs. Dacre, whose assessment of the situation was characteristically more forthright. "A most unfortunate business," she announced, arranging herself on the sofa, with the air of one preparing to deliver judgment. "Though one supposes these things happen, particularly at Mr. Fenton's age. Dr. Haydock says the heart simply gave out, and I dare say he knows best. Still, the timing could hardly have been less convenient." Miss Marple, who had been reflecting that death rarely consulted one's calendar, merely murmured something non-committal. "The funeral will be poorly attended, I fear," Mrs. Dacre continued. "Mr. Fenton was never one to cultivate friendships, a solitary nature, and while one respects his dedication to his work, one does feel that a certain degree of sociability is expected in village life. He fulfilled his duties admirably, of course. One could never fault him there, but duties are not the same as connections, are they?" "He was well regarded, surely," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Well regarded for his usefulness, certainly. That is rather my point. People are expressing their condolences with all the proper phrases naturally, but there's something rather hollow about it, don't you find? As though they're mourning the loss of a convenient functionary rather than a person." This assessment, harsh though it was, contained an element of uncomfortable truth. Miss Marple had observed the same quality in the various expressions of regret that had circulated through the village. Mr. Fenton had been reliable, efficient, thorough, dedicated. These were the words that appeared again and again. But no one spoke of him with affection, with personal warmth, with the kind of genuine sorrow that marks the loss of someone truly valued for themselves rather than for their services. "I understand Mrs. Rowell was quite affected by his death," Miss Marple ventured. "Mrs. Rowell is affected by everything," Mrs. Dacre replied with some asperity. "She has a tender heart, which is admirable, I suppose, though it does lead to a great deal of unnecessary distress. She was the last to see him alive, apparently, and is tormenting herself with all manner of what-ifs and might-have-beens, as though anyone could have prevented a weak heart from failing. After Mrs. Dacre's departure, Miss Marple sat for some time in thought. The rain continued its gentle drumming against the windows, and the afternoon faded toward an early dusk. She found herself thinking about gratitude, about the difference between appreciating someone's utility and valuing their humanity, about the various ways in which communities could fail their members through simple thoughtlessness rather than active unkindness. It was this line of thought that was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Young Tom Wilson, who delivered groceries for the village shop, appeared at her door looking damp and slightly uncomfortable. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, twisting his cap in his hands. "But Mrs. Price said, as you might want to know. There's been some talk at the shop, see, about Mr. Fenton, about how peculiar it was, him dying just then." "Peculiar in what way?" Miss Marple asked, inviting the young man in out of the rain. "Well, miss, it's just that some of the folks are saying things don't quite add up. Mr. Chambers from the ironmonger's, he mentioned that Mr. Fenton had been in last week ordering new latches for his garden shed. Seemed odd, he said, for a man to be improving a shed he'd be dead in a few days later. And Mrs. Bell, who does for the doctor, she said Dr. Haydock seemed bothered about something after examining Mr. Fenton's cottage, though he wouldn't say what." Miss Marple listened with interest. Village gossip, she had long since learned, often contained nuggets of genuine observation buried beneath layers of speculation and embellishment. "People will always wonder," she said gently. "It's natural to look for explanations when something unexpected happens." "Yes, miss. Only, well, some are saying perhaps it wasn't so unexpected as all that. Perhaps Mr. Fenton knew something, or maybe someone else knew something about Mr. Fenton. You know how people talk." Indeed she did, and while she took care to discourage the wilder flights of speculation that tragedy inevitably inspired, she could not entirely dismiss the unease that had been gathering in her own mind since Sunday afternoon. After Tom Wilson had departed, rewarded with a slice of cake and sixpence for his trouble, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting. But her thoughts were not peaceful ones. Gratitude was a curious thing, she reflected. When genuinely felt, it flowed naturally and needed no rehearsal, no careful phrasing, no repetition. When it was absent, or when it was complicated by other emotions, guilt perhaps, or unease, or the recognition of obligations imperfectly discharged, it became stilted, formal, a matter of saying the correct things rather than expressing true feeling. The village's expressions of sorrow over Mr. Fenton's death had that quality of careful correctness. Everyone was saying what ought to be said, but beneath the proper phrases Miss Marple detected something else, relief perhaps, or the satisfaction of a problem neatly resolved without anyone having to take uncomfortable action. She thought of Mrs. Rowell's visit on Friday evening, urging Mr. Fenton to rest, to delay, to let matters lie. She thought of the basket that had arrived at the church while its owner lay dead in his shed. She thought of a man who had been praised for his reliability suddenly failing to appear at the most important event of his calendar. Outside, the rain continued its patient work, washing the streets clean, though some stains, Miss Marple knew from long experience, required more than water to remove them. Some stains required truth, uncomfortable though that commodity might be, and the courage to face what truth revealed about the nature of community, gratitude, and the various quiet cruelties that good people could inflict through simple unwillingness to see what they preferred to ignore. The funeral was set for Thursday. By then, perhaps, the rain would have stopped, and Mr. Fenton could be laid to rest beneath clearing skies. But Miss Marple suspected that other matters would not be resolved quite so easily nor so pleasantly. Chapter 4. The basket no one collected. The rain had indeed ceased by Thursday morning, leaving the world washed clean and glittering beneath a pale sun that seemed to have forgotten the warmth of summer, but not yet surrendered entirely to winter's chill. The funeral of Mr. Leonard Fenton was conducted with all the quiet dignity appropriate to a man who had lived quietly and died unexpectedly. though Miss Marple, standing among the modest gathering of mourners, could not help but observe that dignity was a quality more easily granted to the dead than it had been to the living. The service was brief. The Reverend Hartley spoke with genuine if somewhat vague kindness about a life of service and dedication. A single hymn was sung, the voices of the congregation rising thinly in the cold church, and then the small procession made its way to the churchyard, where a neat grave had been prepared beneath an ancient oak, whose leaves were just beginning to turn. As earth fell upon the coffin with its final irrevocable sound, Miss Marple found her gaze wandering across the assembled mourners. Mrs. Dacre stood with her usual erect posture, her expression appropriately solemn. Miss Hartley dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from genuine emotion or the cold wind was difficult to determine. Mrs. Rowell was visibly distressed, her kind face drawn with what appeared to be more than simple sorrow. Dr. Haydock attended with the professional gravity of one who had signed the death certificate, and could therefore not in good conscience be absent. There were others as well. Mr. Chambers from the ironmonger's, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. Mrs. Bell, Dr. Haydock's housekeeper, whose presence suggested either real regard or thorough curiosity. Young Tom Wilson, standing at the back of the gathering with the awkwardness of youth confronting mortality. And scattered among them, perhaps a dozen other villagers who had come, Miss Marple suspected, more from duty than affection. After the burial, the mourners dispersed quickly, most declining the vicar's tentative invitation to the vicarage for refreshment. There was, it seemed, a general desire to have the matter concluded and return to the comfortable routines of daily life. Mr. Fenton had been properly mourned, properly buried, and could now be properly forgotten. Miss Marple, however, did not immediately return home. Instead, she made her way slowly back into the church, ostensibly to collect her gloves, which she had, she announced to Miss Hartley, quite carelessly left behind during the service. The church was empty now, save for Mr. Clement the sexton, who was tidying the hymnals with his usual methodical attention. The harvest decorations had been removed the day after the festival, as was customary, leaving only the permanent fixtures of worship. Yet near the altar steps, pushed somewhat to the side but not entirely removed, stood Mr. Fenton's basket. Miss Marple approached it with the unhurried step of one who has all the time in the world and intends to use it thoughtfully. The basket was, as she had noted on Sunday, a handsome piece of work, woven with considerable skill. Its contents, however, were what captured her attention. She examined them with care, though without touching. There were apples, certainly, but not the small, slightly misshapen specimens that Mr. Fenton's modest garden might have produced. These were large, perfectly formed, of the variety that required careful cultivation and considerable expertise. There were pears as well, and plums still bearing their delicate bloom, and a collection of vegetables that spoke of multiple gardens, multiple growing methods, multiple sources. Each item bore a small label in Mr. Fenton's distinctive hand. The apples were marked Cox's Orange Pippin, Fletcher Garden. The pears noted Conference Dacre Greenhouse. The plums declared themselves Victoria, Rowell Orchard, South Wall. And so the catalogue continued, each contribution identified with the precision of a man who understood the importance of accurate record-keeping. "Odd, isn't it, miss?" Mr. Clement's voice came from behind her, making her start slightly. "That basket sitting there. I asked the vicar what to do with it, but he said to leave it for now. Said Mr. Fenton's effects would need to be sorted proper-like, and the basket could wait with the rest." "It does seem a shame for such fine produce to go to waste," Miss Marple observed. "Aye, that's what I thought. But here's the peculiar bit, miss. Those labels, see? They're listing where everything came from, down to which tree and which garden. I've never known Mr. Fenton to do that before. Usually he just collected the donations, tallied them up in his ledger, and that was that. But this year it's like he wanted everyone to know exactly who'd contributed what." Miss Marple considered this information while maintaining an expression of mild interest. Perhaps he simply wanted to ensure proper acknowledgement was given. "Maybe so, miss, but it strikes me as odd all the same. Mr. Fenton wasn't one for making a fuss about things. If someone gave generously, he'd note it private-like, but he wouldn't go advertising it. That's what the labels feel like to me, advertising, like he was making a point of something. After Mr. Clement had returned to his duties, Miss Marple stood for a few moments longer, looking at the basket and its carefully documented contents. A point was being made, certainly. But what point, and to whom? She made her way to the vicarage, where she found Miss Hartley in the sitting room, still looking damp-eyed and distressed. "Such a sad occasion," Miss Hartley said, pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly, and somehow made sadder by the smallness of it all. One would have thought, after so many years of faithful service, that more people would have attended. But I suppose Mr. Fenton wasn't the sort to inspire great affection. Respect, certainly, but not affection. The two are not always found together, Miss Marple agreed, though one might argue they should be. "My brother is quite troubled about the accounts," Miss Hartley continued, apparently finding relief in conversation. "He's been going through Mr. Fenton's ledgers, you see, trying to understand his system so that someone else might take over. And he says everything is immaculately recorded, every penny accounted for, but there are these odd little notations in the margins. Nothing official, just Mr. Fenton's private observations, it seems. Things like £3 short, or amount adjusted, or query discrepancy. My brother thinks Mr. Fenton was simply being thorough, checking his own calculations, but it does make one wonder." "Wonder what?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, whether perhaps Mr. Fenton had noticed something. Some irregularity, perhaps, in how the funds were managed or distributed. Not anything serious, I'm sure. Just some small oversight that he was in the process of investigating. And then his heart failed before he could set it right." Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed Miss Hartley to continue. "The thing is, Miss Marple, the Harvest Fund has always been managed by committee. Mr. Fenton kept the records, certainly, but the decisions about distribution were made by all of us together. Myself, Mrs. Dacre, Mrs. Rowell, and one or two others over the years. If there was a discrepancy, it would reflect on all of us, not just on Mr. Fenton. And while I'm sure it's nothing more than a clerical error, one can't help but feel a certain unease about it." "I'm sure your brother will sort it out," Miss Marple said soothingly, though her mind was working with considerably more energy than her tranquil expression suggested. She returned home as the afternoon was beginning its slide toward evening. The cottage welcomed her with its familiar warmth, but her thoughts remained in the cold church, with that basket of carefully labelled produce that no one had collected. Sitting in her accustomed chair, her knitting in her lap but momentarily forgotten, Miss Marple reflected on what she had learned. A man who had handled charitable distributions for years, who had been praised for his efficiency and discretion, had apparently noticed irregularities in the accounts. A man who was universally described as never making a fuss had created a basket whose labels made a very deliberate fuss indeed, documenting contributions with unusual specificity. A man who had seemed, according to Mrs. Rule, preoccupied on the Friday before his death, and who had been urged to let matters lie, to rest, to avoid making things awkward. And then that man had died, alone in his garden shed, on the eve of the harvest festival he had worked so diligently to prepare. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and began to work, her needles moving with their familiar rhythm. Outside, the light was fading, and somewhere in the village, Mr. Fenton's effects were being sorted, his cottage prepared for new occupation, his absence gradually filling in with the ordinary business of daily life. But the basket remained in the church, its labels bearing witness to something that Miss Marple was beginning to suspect had very little to do with gratitude, and a great deal to do with the uncomfortable truths that emerge when someone finally decides to make accurate records of who has given what and who has received more than their fair share. The harvest, it seemed, had revealed more than the abundance of the earth. It had revealed the careful accounting of a quiet man who had, perhaps, grown tired of discretion at the expense of honesty. Chapter 5. Praise given a little too loudly. The week following the funeral settled into the kind of determined normalcy that often characterises a community's response to unsettling events. The weather improved, the shops resumed their usual commerce, and conversations turned from the late Mr. Fenton to more comfortable topics such as the upcoming church bazaar and Mrs. Price's new recipe for seed cake, which was generally agreed to be an improvement on her previous efforts, though perhaps a trifle heavy on the caraway. Miss Marple, observing these developments from her vantage point at the window, and during her careful excursions into the village proper, noted that the determined quality of this normalcy suggested it was not quite as natural as everyone wished to believe. There was something too emphatic about the way people had closed the door on recent events, as though they feared what might emerge if that door were left even slightly ajar. It was during one of her morning walks, undertaken for the dual purpose of exercise and observation, that she encountered Mrs. Dacre emerging from the post office, with an expression that managed to combine satisfaction with something approaching defiance. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Dacre said, her tone brisk. "A fine day, is it not? Most suitable for putting unpleasant matters behind us and attending to current responsibilities." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, falling into step beside her, "though I understand the vicar is still occupied with sorting through Mr. Fenton's records." "Yes, well, that is unavoidable, I suppose, though I must say the fuss being made over a few marginal notations seems quite excessive. My own examination of the accounts revealed nothing more than the natural complications that arise in any charitable enterprise, small adjustments, minor corrections, the sort of thing that occurs when one is dealing with fluctuating donations and variable needs. Hardly cause for concern." "You've examined the accounts, then?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Naturally. As a member of the distribution committee, I felt it my duty to ensure there were no actual irregularities that might reflect poorly on our stewardship. I found everything perfectly in order. Mr. Fenton's notations were merely his way of tracking various transactions. The man was meticulous to a fault, which is admirable, I suppose, though it can lead to unnecessary complication when simple trust would suffice." They had reached the corner where their paths diverged, but Mrs. Dacre seemed inclined to continue the conversation, her manner suggesting she had more to communicate, and was determined to do so before witnesses, as it were. "I have been hearing certain whispers," she said, lowering her voice though there was no one within hearing distance. "Suggestions that Mr. Fenton's death was somehow suspicious, or that there were matters left unresolved. I wish to make it perfectly clear, Miss Marple, that such speculation is both unfounded and unseemly. Dr. Haydock has certified the cause of death. The accounts are in order. Mr. Fenton was a reliable servant of the parish who met with a natural and unfortunate end. To suggest otherwise dishonours his memory and creates unnecessary disturbance in the community." "I'm sure no one wishes to dishonour his memory," Miss Marple said gently. "Then they should cease their idle gossip. Mr. Fenton dedicated years to serving this village, and the least we can do is allow him to rest in peace without subjecting his name to baseless innuendo." Mrs. Dacre drew herself up to her full height. "I have made my position quite clear to anyone who has raised the subject with me, and I trust that sensible people will recognise the wisdom of moving forward rather than dwelling on matters that are both settled and closed." After Mrs. Dacre had departed with a curt nod, Miss Marple continued her walk, though her destination had become somewhat uncertain. She found herself, as though by accident, near the row of cottages that included Mr. Fenton's former residence. The cottage stood empty now, its windows reflecting the morning sun without any answering warmth from within. The garden, which Mr. Fenton had tended with his usual methodical care, already showed signs of neglect, a few weeds emerging among the neat rows as though testing whether the discipline that had governed them had truly departed. She was still standing there, lost in thought, when Dr. Haydock came striding down the lane with his medical bag, evidently returning from a house call. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, pausing beside her, contemplating mortality among the cabbages. "Something like that," Miss Marple admitted with a slight smile. "Though I confess I was thinking more about Mr. Fenton than about philosophical matters." Dr. Haydock's expression became more guarded. "Straightforward case, as I told the vicar. Heart failure. The man's heart had been compromised for years, though he refused to acknowledge it, insisted on maintaining his usual routines, his usual responsibilities. I warned him more than once to take care, but he was stubborn in his quiet way. You examined the cottage, I understand, when you found him. Had to, didn't I? Constable needed a proper determination of death. Found him in his garden shed, seated in that old chair of his, looking for all the world as though he'd simply dozed off. No signs of distress, no indication of struggle or suffering. Quick and relatively merciful as these things go. Were there any other observations you made? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual but her eyes keen. Dr. Haydock hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Look here, Miss Marple. I know you have a way of seeing things that others miss, and I've learned to respect that over the years. So I'll tell you this much. The cottage was locked from inside, yes, but the shed door was unlatched. Now, that might mean nothing. Man might have gone out for a breath of air, felt his heart giving way, and made it to the shed before collapsing. But it struck me as odd that he'd have gone to the shed rather than back inside to his telephone, or at least to somewhere more comfortable. Perhaps he kept medication in the shed. Checked for that. Nothing but garden tools and the usual shed clutter. No medicines, no remedies. Nothing that would explain why he'd have chosen to go there when he was in distress. Dr. Haydock shifted his bag from one hand to the other. And there was something else. On his kitchen table, there was a ledger open to the most recent entries, the Harvest Fund accounts from what I could see. And next to it, several sheets of paper with calculations, comparisons of figures, that sort of thing, as though he'd been working on them just before he went out to the shed. Did you mention this to anyone else? Told the constable, naturally, he made a note of it, but when I mentioned it later to the vicar, he seemed to think it was simply Mr. Fenton's usual thoroughness. Said the man was always checking and rechecking his figures, wanted everything perfect for the festival. Dr. Haydock frowned. Maybe that's all it was, but combined with Mrs. Rowell's visit the evening before, and her saying he seemed troubled about something, well, it leaves an uneasy feeling. They parted shortly after, Dr. Haydock continuing on his rounds and Miss Marple making her way slowly homeward. But her route took her past the church, and she found herself drawn inside, as much for the quiet as for any specific purpose. The basket was gone. In its place near the altar was a vase of chrysanthemums, their copper heads glowing in the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows. Miss Marple inquired of Mr. Clement, who was polishing the brass candlesticks with his usual devotion. "Oh, aye, miss. The vicar had me distribute the contents to the families on the charity list. Said it was what Mr. Fenton would have wanted, the produce going to those who needed it rather than sitting about going to waste. Kept the labels, though, in case they were needed for the records." "That was thoughtful," Miss Marple said. "Were the distributions made according to Mr. Fenton's usual system?" "Well, now, there's the thing, miss. The vicar had me use the old list from last year, seeing as how Mr. Fenton's new list hadn't been finalised. Said it was simpler that way, and everyone who'd received before would receive again. Fair's fair, he said." After leaving the church, Miss Marple found herself invited to take tea with Mrs. Rule, who had sent a note round that morning expressing a desire for company. She arrived to find the good lady in a state of considerable agitation, her usual serene countenance marred by worry lines and an expression of genuine distress. "I'm so glad you've come, Miss Marple," Mrs. Rowell said, ushering her into the comfortable sitting room where a tea tray had already been prepared. "I've been quite beside myself these past few days, and I simply must talk to someone who will understand." "Whatever is troubling you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, accepting her cup with sympathy. "It's about Mr. Fenton, and my visit to him that Friday evening. I've been thinking about it constantly, going over every word of our conversation, and I'm beginning to fear I did something terribly wrong." Mrs. Rowell's eyes filled with tears. "You see, he wanted to talk to me about the harvest distributions. He said he'd been reviewing the accounts and had noticed certain patterns that troubled him. Nothing accusatory, you understand. He was far too gentle for that. But he said some families had been receiving rather more than their circumstances warranted, while others who were equally or more deserving had been overlooked." "And what did you say to him?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "I'm afraid I discouraged him from pursuing the matter. I told him that these things were always complicated, that what might appear irregular on paper often had perfectly reasonable explanations in practice. I reminded him that the festival was meant to be a time of thanksgiving and harmony, not of uncomfortable questions and potential embarrassment. I suggested he wait until after the festival to raise any concerns, give himself time to consider whether they were truly significant. Mrs. Rowell's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and then I left him there, alone with his doubts, and by the next evening he was dead. You mustn't blame yourself for his death, Miss Marple said firmly. His heart would have failed regardless of what you said or didn't say. But don't you see, Miss Marple, I put my own comfort, the villagers' comfort, ahead of his concerns. He trusted me enough to share his worries, and I dismissed them. I chose convenience over honesty, and now I keep wondering whether that burden of unexpressed truth somehow contributed to the strain on his heart. Whether if I'd listened, truly listened, and encouraged him to speak his concerns aloud, things might have been different. Miss Marple set down her teacup and regarded Mrs. Rowell with compassion. "Tell me," she said quietly, "these families who received more than their circumstances warranted, do you know which families Mr. Fenton meant?" Mrs. Rowell hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He didn't name names, but I could infer from the way he spoke, and when I thought about it later I realized he was quite right. There have been certain adjustments made over the years, certain allowances given that perhaps weren't entirely justified. Small things, really, but they accumulated, and those of us on the committee, well, we convinced ourselves we were being generous, being Christian. But perhaps we were really just being comfortable, avoiding difficult conversations about who truly needed help, and who was simply skilled at appearing needy. And these adjustments," Miss Marple said carefully, "would they be reflected in Mr. Fenton's records?" "Oh yes. Mr. Fenton recorded everything. Every donation, every distribution, every adjustment made by committee decision. He was scrupulously honest in his record keeping, which is why his marginal notations have been causing such concern. They show that he noticed the discrepancies and was attempting to understand them." In the silence that followed, Miss Marple reflected that praise given too loudly often serves to drown out quieter voices asking uncomfortable questions, and she thought that perhaps Mr. Fenton's death had been convenient in more ways than one, though she very much doubted that anyone had consciously wished for such convenience. Sometimes, she reflected, the most dangerous thing a person could do was simply to keep accurate records and ask gentle questions about them. Chapter 6. A Debt Remembered Sideways. The following days brought Miss Marple an increasing number of visitors, which was not in itself unusual, but the nature of these visits suggested a certain unease percolating beneath the village's surface calm. People who normally exchange pleasantries only at church or in the shops suddenly found reasons to call, to linger over tea, to speak in circles around subjects they were reluctant to address directly. It was Miss Hartley who provided the most revealing insight, though she did so in her characteristically indirect fashion. She arrived on Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to return a knitting pattern she had borrowed some weeks earlier, but settled herself with such evident relief at finding a sympathetic audience that Miss Marple suspected the pattern was merely a convenient pretext. "My brother has been going through Mr. Fenton's papers more thoroughly," Miss Hartley began, after the usual courtesies had been observed and tea poured. "Not just the church accounts, you understand, but his personal effects. There wasn't much, really. The man lived very simply. But among his things, my brother found a notebook, quite separate from the official ledgers, a sort of personal journal, though not in the usual sense, more a record of observations, small kindnesses he'd done or witnessed, that sort of thing." "How interesting," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "Yes, well, the interesting part is what those observations reveal about Mr. Fenton himself. We all thought we knew him, you see. Quiet, reliable, somewhat colourless. But this notebook suggests a rather different person, someone who noticed a great deal more than he ever let on, and who had been quietly helping people for years in ways no one ever knew about." Miss Hartley paused to sip her tea, gathering her thoughts. There are entries going back decades, little notes about families who were struggling, about children who needed shoes, about elderly people who couldn't quite manage their rent, and next to each entry there are amounts noted. Small sums, nothing dramatic but consistently given. It appears that Mr. Fenton had been using his own modest income to supplement the official charitable distributions when he felt they fell short of actual need. That was very generous of him, Miss Marple observed. Yes, but here's the peculiar thing. He never told anyone, never claimed credit, never sought recognition. And more than that, he arranged things so that the recipients never knew the money came from him personally. He would adjust the official distributions in his records to make it appear that the parish had been more generous than it actually was, then make up the difference from his own pocket. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment before resuming their rhythm. That would explain some of the marginal notations in the official accounts. Exactly. My brother has been comparing the two sets of records, and it's becoming clear that what appeared to be discrepancies were actually Mr. Fenton's way of tracking which distributions he had personally supplemented. He used phrases like amount adjusted to indicate where he'd added his own money, and query discrepancy when the official allocation seemed insufficient for genuine need. How very thoughtful of him, Miss Marple said quietly. But it also means, Miss Hartley continued, her voice dropping, that some of us on the committee were not as generous as we believed ourselves to be. We would allocate what we thought was adequate, congratulate ourselves on our Christian charity, and never realize that Mr. Fenton was quietly making our inadequate gifts adequate through his own sacrifice. He allowed us to feel virtuous while he bore the actual cost of that virtue. Miss Marple considered this revelation while pouring more tea. Did his notebook mention specific instances? Oh yes, quite detailed in fact. For example, there's an entry from 5 years ago about the Davison family, when Mr. Davison lost his position at the mill. The committee allocated £3 for their Christmas basket, but Mr. Fenton added another £2 of his own because he knew they had 4 children and winter coming on. We never knew. Mrs. Davison probably thought the parish had been more generous than we actually were. And there are many such entries, Miss Marple inquired. Dozens, spread over years. The amounts were never large individually, but cumulatively they must have represented a significant portion of his income. And the thing is, Miss Marple, some of the entries include observations that make one rather uncomfortable. Little notes about how certain committee members seemed more concerned with appearances than with actual need, or how decisions were sometimes made based on who would be appropriately grateful rather than who was most deserving. Miss Hartley set down her cup with hands that trembled slightly. There's one entry from last year that troubles me particularly. It concerns the Marsh family, elderly people who live in that cottage near the church. They've fallen on hard times due to medical expenses, and Mr. Fenton noted that he'd suggested increasing their allocation, but the committee decided against it because Mrs. Marsh had apparently offended Mrs. Dacre by making some comment about the Women's Institute accounts. I see, Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she saw rather more than Miss Hartley was explicitly stating. So Mr. Fenton supplemented their allocation himself and added a note that read, "Pride is expensive, and the proud rarely pay its cost themselves." I can't stop thinking about that phrase, Miss Marple. The proud rarely pay its cost themselves. It suggests he understood perfectly well that our committee decisions were sometimes motivated by personal feelings, rather than genuine assessment of need, and that he was quietly correcting our mistakes at his own expense. After Miss Hartley's departure, Miss Marple sat for a considerable time in thought. The picture emerging of Mr. Leonard Fenton was becoming clearer, and it was not the portrait of a colourless, unremarkable man that the village had painted in its eulogies. Rather, it was the picture of someone who had seen clearly, judged fairly, and acted with quiet integrity even when it cost him personally, and gained him nothing in terms of recognition or gratitude. Her reflections were interrupted by the arrival of young Tom Wilson, who appeared at her door looking hesitant and slightly furtive. "Begging your pardon again, Miss Marple," he said, twisting his cap in the familiar gesture of uncertainty. "But there's something I think you ought to know, seeing as how you're the sort who notices things." "Come in, Tom," Miss Marple invited. "You look as though you could use a cup of tea." Settled in the kitchen with tea and a generous slice of cake, Tom unburdened himself. "It's about my mum, miss. She's been in a right state since Mr. Fenton died, and finally yesterday she told me why. See, 3 years back, when my dad passed sudden like we were in a bad way, Mum had no income and me still in school. The parish gave us a basket at Christmas and Mum thought it was from the committee, but last week she got a letter." "A letter?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "From Mr. Fenton's solicitor, it turns out. Apparently Mr. Fenton left instructions that if anything happened to him, certain people were to be informed of kindnesses he'd done them, so they'd know not to feel indebted to others who hadn't actually helped. The letter explained that half the money in that Christmas basket came from Mr. Fenton's own pocket, not from the parish at all, and not just at Christmas, but for 2 years after there were supplements to what the committee gave us. Mum had been so grateful to the parish, you see, and especially to Mrs. Dacre, who chaired the committee, and now she finds out it was Mr. Fenton all along, and she never thanked him proper, never even knew to thank him. How very like him," Miss Marple said softly, "to want people to know the truth only after he was gone, when gratitude could no longer embarrass him." "Aye, that's what Mum said too. But here's the thing, Miss Marple. If the letter was meant to be sent after his death, it means he prepared it in advance, like he was putting his affairs in order. And Mum says that when a man starts putting his affairs in order and making sure debts are remembered proper, it sometimes means he knows something about his time being short. Or maybe," Tom added, his young face troubled, "it means he was afraid something might happen to him." After Tom had gone, Miss Marple sat with her knitting as the afternoon shadows lengthened across her garden. A debt remembered sideways, she thought. Mr. Fenton had arranged for his kindnesses to be acknowledged, but only after his death, and in a way that revealed as much about those who had taken credit for generosity they hadn't shown as it did about his own charity. It was a curious thing to do, unless one anticipated not being present to set the record straight oneself. Unless one suspected that truth might need to be told by proxy, through carefully prepared letters and meticulously kept records. She thought about Mrs. Rowell's visit to Mr. Fenton on that Friday evening, urging him not to make things awkward. She thought about the basket with its careful labels, documenting exactly who had contributed what. She thought about the ledger open on his kitchen table and the calculation spread beside it. Mr. Fenton had been preparing something, recording something, arranging for certain truths to emerge after his death. The question was whether he had anticipated that death would come naturally and soon, or whether he had feared it might come for other reasons entirely. And if the latter, Miss Marple reflected as her needles clicked softly in the quiet room, then perhaps his death had not been quite as natural as Dr. Haydock's certificate proclaimed. Perhaps the strain on Mr. Fenton's weak heart had not come solely from age and infirmity, but from the burden of knowing uncomfortable truths, and the decision, finally, to stop carrying that burden in silence. Sometimes, she thought, the most dangerous thing a person could possess was not wealth or power, but simply the determination to ensure that debts were remembered correctly, and that kindness was credited to those who had actually shown it rather than those who had merely accepted the thanks. Chapter 7. When kindness arrived too late, Sunday arrived again, bringing with it the usual procession of villagers toward the church, though Miss Marple noticed a certain subdued quality to the gathering that had not been present a fortnight earlier. Perhaps it was simply the natural result of October deepening toward November, the earlier brightness giving way to grey skies and the first real chill of approaching winter. Or perhaps it was something less tangible, a collective unease that had settled over St. Mary Mead like morning mist, persistent and penetrating despite all efforts to dispel it. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her custom, and found herself sharing a pew with Mrs. Bell, Dr. Haydock's housekeeper, a woman of practical disposition and considerable discretion who had served the doctor for more than 20 years and had, in consequence, acquired a certain understanding of human nature in both its physical and moral ailments. "A difficult week for some," Mrs. Bell remarked quietly as the organ began its preliminary wheezing. The doctors had more visits than usual, mostly from folks complaining of troubles sleeping or feeling poorly in ways they can't quite name. conscience troubles, if you ask me, though they'd never admit it in those terms. Conscience can be most uncomfortable, Miss Marple agreed softly. Aye, and more so when it arrives late to the party, as you might say. Easy enough to feel sorry after the fact, harder to do right when it costs something beforehand. Mrs. Bell adjusted her gloves with brisk efficiency. The doctor mentioned you'd been asking questions about Mr. Fenton's cottage, about what was found there. I thought you should know. There was something else he noticed but didn't much speak of. Miss Marple waited, her expression attentive but patient. In Mr. Fenton's kitchen, there was that tray of food Mrs. Rowell had brought him. A nice supper by the looks of it. Cold meat, fresh bread, a bit of cheese, some of Mrs. Rowell's famous apple tart, all laid out proper on good china, as though Mr. Fenton had meant to enjoy it, but not a bite taken. The bread hadn't even been cut. Perhaps he wasn't hungry, Miss Marple suggested. That's what the doctor thought at first. But here's the thing. The kettle was on the stove, stone cold by the time they found it, but positioned as though someone had been about to make tea. And there was a cup and saucer set out beside it, with a tea caddy open nearby. So he'd been preparing to sit down to his supper, making himself comfortable like. Then something changed his mind, and instead of eating, he went out to his shed and died there. How very curious, Miss Marple murmured. The doctor thinks maybe he felt his heart troubling him, went to the shed to fetch something, and was overcome before he could get back. But I've been thinking about it, Miss Marple, and it don't quite make sense. If a man's heart is giving him trouble, why would he go away from his telephone, away from help? And why would he leave good food to go cold when he'd just gone to the trouble of setting it all out? The service began before Miss Marple could respond, but her mind remained occupied with Mrs. Bell's observations throughout the hymns and prayers. A man preparing his supper, then abandoning it untouched. A kettle positioned to boil but never lit. A careful arrangement of food on good china, suggesting an intention to dine with some degree of ceremony rather than simply eating from convenience. And then the sudden departure to the garden shed, to die alone in the cold darkness while warmth and sustenance waited inside. After the service, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly homeward alongside Mrs. Rowell, who had evidently been waiting for an opportunity to speak privately. "I've been wanting to ask your advice, Miss Marple," Mrs. Rowell began, her usually cheerful countenance clouded with worry. "About that evening when I visited Mr. Fenton. I've been replaying it in my mind constantly, and there are aspects of it that trouble me deeply." "Would it help to speak of it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I think it might." Mrs. Rowell drew a deep breath. "You see, I brought him supper that evening. I often did that sort of thing for people living alone, and I knew Mr. Fenton was never much good at cooking for himself. I'd made a nice spread with some of my apple tart that he'd always been partial to. When I arrived, he seemed pleased to see me, invited me in, thanked me for the food, but he didn't ask me to stay while he ate it, which was unusual. Usually he'd invite me to sit for a moment, have a cup of tea while he started his meal, but that evening he seemed, well, distracted." They had reached the gate of Mrs. Rowell's cottage, but she made no move to enter, seemingly needing to complete her account. "I asked him if something was troubling him, and that's when he mentioned the accounts. He was very gentle about it, very careful not to accuse anyone directly. But he said he'd been going through the records preparing for the harvest distribution, and he'd noticed certain patterns that concerned him. Some families, he said, had been receiving allocations that seemed generous given their actual circumstances, while others who were genuinely struggling had received less. He wondered if perhaps the committee might review the criteria, make things more equitable." "And how did you respond?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew. "I'm afraid I didn't respond well at all," Mrs. Rowell's eyes filled with tears. "I told him he was making too much of minor variations, that these decisions were always complicated, that we couldn't possibly investigate every recipient's circumstances in detail. And then, Miss Marple, I said something I deeply regret. I told him that the Harvest Festival was meant to celebrate harmony and thanksgiving, not to stir up questions about who deserved what. I said that if he raised these concerns publicly, it would create awkwardness and upset, and might damage the reputation of people who had worked very hard for the parish over many years. "You were thinking of Mrs. Dacre," Miss Marple said, not as a question. "Yes. Mrs. Dacre has always been the driving force behind our charitable efforts, and she has very decided views about who deserves help and who doesn't. Mr. Fenton's observations would have suggested that her judgments were sometimes influenced by personal feeling rather than actual need, and I knew she would be mortified. So I urged him to wait, to think it over, to consider whether it was really worth creating such disturbance." Mrs. Rule fumbled for her handkerchief. "And he listened to me, Miss Marple. He listened and nodded, and said perhaps I was right, perhaps he was being too particular. He thanked me for the supper, and for my counsel, and I left feeling I'd done a good deed, prevented an uncomfortable situation, and now I realise what I actually did was silence him, convince him to keep his concerns to himself, to preserve everyone else's comfort, and the burden of that silence may have killed him." "My dear, you cannot think his death was your fault," Miss Marple said firmly. "Can't I? I've thought about it so carefully, Miss Marple. He was preparing to eat the supper I'd brought him. He'd set it all out, was making tea, and then something happened. Something made him leave all that and go out to his shed in the cold evening. What if he was preparing to telephone someone, to confide his concerns to another person since I had dismissed them? What if the stress of that decision, of knowing he would have to speak uncomfortable truths despite my advice, was what brought on his heart attack?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "When you left him that evening, what was his state of mind?" "That's what haunts me. He seemed resigned, I suppose, as though he'd accepted that his concerns would have to remain unspoken. He thanked me very formally for my visit, for my advice, for the supper, and there was something in the way he thanked me that felt final, as though he was closing a door." Mrs. Rule's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking that perhaps he decided his concerns would have to be addressed differently, that since the living wouldn't listen, he would have to arrange for the truth to emerge after his death. Those letters he prepared, that notebook he kept, they suggest a man who knew his time was short and wanted to ensure certain things would be revealed. Or a man who feared his time might be made short," Miss Marple said quietly. Mrs. Rule looked at her sharply. Surely you don't think anyone would have wished him harm?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that harm can come in many forms. Sometimes it arrives with obvious malice, but more often it comes dressed as concern, as the desire to preserve harmony, as the urge to protect people from uncomfortable truths. Your kindness arrived too late to help Mr. Fenton, Mrs. Rowell, but it was still kindness. The question is whether others showed him any kindness at all, early or late." They parted at the gate, Mrs. Rule retreating into her cottage with the burdened step of one carrying a weight that cannot easily be set down. Miss Marple continued homeward, her mind turning over the accumulating details like pieces of a puzzle that was gradually revealing its pattern. A man silenced by kindly advice, preparing to eat a supper brought by the very person who had urged his silence. A man who had set out food and kettle, suggesting an intention to dine, then abandoned both to die in his garden shed. A man who had prepared letters to be sent after his death, documenting kindnesses that others had claimed credit for, revealing patterns of favouritism in charitable distributions, and underlying it all, the question that Miss Marple could no longer avoid: had Mr. Fenton's weak heart simply failed? Or had something happened that evening, some final burden or realization or perhaps even encounter that had proved too much for it to bear? Kindness that arrived too late was still kinder than cruelty delivered on time. But sometimes, Miss Marple reflected as she reached her cottage gate, the absence of cruelty was not the same as the presence of goodness, and the difference between the two could be measured in cold suppers and unopened kettles, and men dying alone in garden sheds while the village slept peacefully, never suspecting that the morning would bring them the convenient resolution of an inconvenient conscience. Chapter 8. The Shape of a Silence. Miss Marple had always believed that understanding came not from dramatic revelations, but from the patient accumulation of small truths, each one fitting into the next like the pieces of her knitting gradually forming a coherent whole. It was on Monday afternoon, while engaged in precisely such knitting and reflecting upon precisely such truths, that she received an unexpected visit from the Reverend Hartley himself. The vicar was a good man, conscientious in his duties and genuinely devoted to his flock, but he was not, Miss Marple had long since observed, particularly comfortable with moral ambiguity. He preferred his world arranged in clear categories of right and wrong, proper and improper, and was invariably distressed when reality declined to cooperate with these neat divisions. "Miss Marple," he began, accepting tea with the abstracted air of one whose mind is elsewhere, "I find myself in need of your counsel. My sister suggested you might be able to help me understand something that has been troubling me greatly." "I shall certainly try," Miss Marple said encouragingly. "It concerns Mr. Fenton, and more specifically his state of mind in the days before his death. You see, I have been examining his records more closely, and I've found something that disturbs me." The vicar set down his cup and leaned forward earnestly. "There are entries in his personal notebook, dated the week before his death, that suggest he was preparing to take some action regarding the Harvest Fund distributions, but they're written in a peculiar way, almost as though he was rehearsing an argument he intended to make." "What sort of argument?" Miss Marple inquired. "He wrote out various scenarios, different ways of presenting his concerns. In one entry, he outlined how he might approach the committee diplomatically, emphasizing his respect for their judgment while gently suggesting that a review might be beneficial. In another, he considered whether he should speak to individual members privately, rather than raising the matter in a group setting. And in a third, the vicar paused, his discomfort evident. He contemplated whether he should bypass the committee entirely and bring the matter directly to me, or even to the bishop if necessary. He was being very thorough, Miss Marple observed. "Yes, but it's what he wrote after these various scenarios that troubles me. After each approach he added a note assessing the likely response, and Miss Marple, his assessments were quite cynical, really. He anticipated that diplomatic approaches would be dismissed, that private conversations would be met with defensiveness, and that involving higher authorities would be seen as betrayal and would likely result in his removal from his position." The vicar stood and paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "But here's what disturbs me most. His final entry, written the day before his death, simply says, 'I have decided to let the records speak for themselves when I'm no longer here to complicate matters with my presence. Truth should not require a living advocate to make it acceptable.' What do you make of that, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her needle still. "It sounds," she said carefully, "like the words of a man who had concluded that his concerns would only be taken seriously after his death, when they could be examined without the complication of personal feelings toward the messenger. But surely that suggests a rather dark state of mind, as though he had, given up on being heard while alive." The vicar turned from the window, his face troubled. "Dr. Haydock assures me the death was natural, that Mr. Fenton's heart had been weak for years. But I can't help wondering if despair, a sense of futility, might have contributed to the failure. If a man believes his voice has no value, might that not place an unbearable strain on an already weakened heart?" "It might indeed," Miss Marple agreed quietly, "though I think perhaps despair is too strong a word. Mr. Fenton strikes me as having been remarkably clear-sighted rather than despairing. He saw the situation accurately and made practical arrangements accordingly. But to prepare for one's death in such a methodical way, to arrange for revelations to be made posthumously, it seems almost as though he expected or even anticipated his death. Or, Miss Marple suggested gently, as though he feared it might be hastened if his intentions became known while he was still alive to pursue them." The vicar stared at her. "Surely you cannot mean to suggest foul play? Dr. Haydock found no evidence of anything unnatural." "I suggest nothing definite," Miss Marple said, "but I do think it worth considering all the shapes that silence can take. There is the silence of respect, allowing someone privacy and dignity. There is the silence of compassion, refraining from speaking painful truths, and there is the silence of convenience, when truth is suppressed because its expression would be uncomfortable for those who prefer things to remain as they are. The vicar returned to his seat, his tea forgotten. You're suggesting that someone, or several someones, actively work to keep Mr. Fenton silent. I'm suggesting that Mr. Fenton found himself in a position where speaking truth would create significant disturbance for people who had considerable social standing and influence in the village. Mrs. Rowell has already told me how she urged him to delay, to consider whether his concerns were truly worth the awkwardness they would cause. Can you imagine how many similar conversations he might have had or anticipated having with others? But Mrs. Rowell is the gentlest soul imaginable. She would never wish anyone harm. No, of course not. But gentle people can sometimes do great harm through their very gentleness, through their desire to smooth over difficulties and preserve pleasant appearances. Mrs. Rowell urged Mr. Fenton to silence out of kindness, but the effect was to leave him isolated with his concerns, convinced that no one wanted to hear them. The vicar absorbed this slowly. You think the shape of that silence, the accumulation of all those gentle discouragements, might have been what killed him. Not any single action, but the collective weight of everyone preferring him to remain quiet. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mr. Fenton spent years observing how the parish's charity was administered, how certain people received more than they needed while others received less, how decisions were influenced by personal preference rather than genuine assessment of need. And I think that when he finally decided to address these inequities, he discovered that no one wanted to hear about them. Not because they were cruel people, but because acknowledging the truth would require them to admit they had been complicit in those inequities. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Consider what he faced, Vicar. If he spoke diplomatically, he would be dismissed as overly particular. If he pressed the matter, he would be accused of ingratitude toward people who had trusted him with responsibilities. If he provided evidence, he would be making accusations against respected members of the community. And underlying all of this was the knowledge that he held his position entirely at the pleasure of that same community and could be removed if he became inconvenient. So he decided to remain silent during his life and let the truth emerge after his death, when it couldn't be attributed to personal animosity or ambition, the vicar concluded slowly. But Miss Marple, if he made that decision, if he accepted that silence, then how did it kill him? Because silence is not passive, Vicar. It is active and effortful, particularly for an honest man. Every day Mr. Fenton kept silent. He had to carry the burden of knowing that people were being treated unfairly, that charity was being administered according to favouritism rather than need, that the parish he served was operating on principles that violated everything he believed about justice and compassion. That is an exhausting burden, especially when one is already physically weakened. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her voice remaining gentle but firm, and on that Friday evening Mrs. Rowell came to him with her kind concern and her gentle urging toward continued silence. She brought him supper, which suggests she cared for his physical welfare, but she also brought him the confirmation that his concerns would not be welcome, that speaking them would be seen as creating awkwardness rather than addressing injustice. And after she left, he sat down to the supper she'd brought him, prepared to make tea, and then something happened. What do you think happened? The vicar asked quietly. I think he realised the full weight of what he had accepted. I think he saw clearly that by remaining silent, he was complicit in the very injustices he had documented so carefully. I think he understood that his silence was not protecting anyone. It was simply allowing wrong to continue comfortably. And I think that realisation, coming on top of years of accumulated frustration and moral compromise, placed an unbearable strain on his already weakened heart. The vicar sat in silence for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with recognition. So his death was natural in the medical sense, but not in the moral sense. We killed him, collectively, not through any violent action, but through our collective preference for comfort over truth. I would not phrase it quite so dramatically, Miss Marple said. But I do think that when a community makes it clear that truth is less welcome than pleasant falsehood, that justice is less valued than social harmony, then those who insist on truth and justice find themselves in an impossible position, and sometimes that impossible position has physical consequences. After the vicar had departed, promising to think carefully about what she had said, Miss Marple sat for a long time with her knitting idle in her lap. The shape of a silence, she thought. The particular contours of all the things that were not said, not acknowledged, not addressed. Mr. Fenton had mapped that shape carefully in his notebook, documenting not just the charitable distributions, but the social mechanisms that kept certain truths from being spoken. And in the end, the silence itself had taken on such weight, such density, such overwhelming presence, that it had crushed the one person who had tried to bear it with integrity. Outside, the October afternoon was fading into evening, and somewhere in the village people were going about their ordinary business, comfortable in their routines, relieved that an uncomfortable matter had been resolved without requiring anything of them beyond a funeral attendance and a few properly sympathetic phrases. But Miss Marple knew, as she suspected the vicar now knew as well, that some silences could not be maintained indefinitely. Truth had a way of emerging even when it had been carefully buried beneath layers of social convention and well-meaning discouragement. The question was whether the village of St. Mary Mead was ready to hear what Mr. Fenton's silence had been protecting them from having to acknowledge. Chapter 9. Miss Marple reflects on gratitude. The following morning brought one of those soft grey days that seem designed for introspection, when the world draws inward and the mind, deprived of vivid external distractions, turns naturally to contemplation. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her habit, and after attending to her modest household duties, she settled herself in her sitting room with her knitting and the comfortable awareness that she had several hours ahead of her in which to think without interruption. She was, however, to be disappointed in this expectation, for shortly after 10 o'clock Mrs. Rowell arrived unannounced, her face bearing such an expression of determination mixed with distress that Miss Marple immediately set aside her needlework and prepared herself for revelations. "I cannot continue without speaking," Mrs. Rowell announced, removing her hat with trembling hands. "I have spent 3 nights without proper sleep, turning everything over in my mind, and I have come to certain conclusions that must be shared, whatever the consequences." "Please sit down," Miss Marple said gently, noting that Mrs. Rowell's usual composure had been entirely abandoned. "Tell me what troubles you so deeply." Mrs. Rowell sat but on the edge of her chair, as though even at rest she could not quite settle. "After our conversation on Sunday, I went home and began thinking very carefully about that evening with Mr. Fenton. Not just what was said, but what was not said, what was implied, what I chose not to notice at the time, because noticing would have required me to act differently." "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged. "When I arrived with his supper, he seemed, as I mentioned, distracted. But now, looking back with clearer eyes, I realise he was not distracted in the sense of being scattered or confused. He was rather intensely focused, in the way people are when they have made a difficult decision and are gathering their courage to act upon it. He thanked me for the food, but there was something formal in his thanks, almost as though he was saying goodbye." Mrs. Rowell's hands twisted together in her lap. "And when I urged him not to raise his concerns about the distributions, not to make things awkward during the harvest festival, he did not argue with me. He simply agreed very quietly that perhaps I was right. But Miss Marple, I have been thinking about that agreement, and I believe now that he was not actually agreeing with me at all. He was simply accepting that I, like everyone else, preferred his silence to his honesty." "That must have been painful for him to realise," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, and I think it was more than painful. I think it was clarifying. Because after he agreed with me, he said something I didn't fully register at the time. He said, 'I understand perfectly, Mrs. Rowell. No one wishes to hear unpleasant truths during a time of celebration, and perhaps no one wishes to hear them at any time.' And then he smiled, such a sad smile, and added, 'But truth has its own timing, does it not? It finds its way to the surface eventually, even when we bury it most carefully.' Mrs. Rule paused, drawing a shaky breath. At the time, I thought he was simply being philosophical, accepting that his concerns were minor and could be left unaddressed. But now I understand he was telling me quite plainly that he had already decided how to handle the situation. He would document everything carefully and arrange for the truth to emerge after his death, when it could be examined without the complication of his presence making people defensive. "You think he anticipated dying soon?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I think he knew his heart was weak, yes. Dr. Haydock had warned him more than once, but I think there was something more to it than simple awareness of mortality." Mrs. Rule met Miss Marple's eyes directly. "I think he was exhausted, Miss Marple. Exhausted by the burden of knowing things others preferred not to know, exhausted by the effort of maintaining silence when everything in his nature called for honesty, exhausted by the loneliness of being the only person who seemed to care that charity was being distributed according to favouritism rather than need." She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the grey garden. "After I left him that evening, I went home feeling I had done a good deed, prevented an unpleasant situation. But what I actually did was confirm for him that he was utterly alone in his concerns, that even the kindest people in the village, even those who prided themselves on their Christian charity, would choose comfort over justice when the two came into conflict." "You were trying to protect him as much as protect the committee," Miss Marple suggested. "Was I? I've been asking myself that question repeatedly. I told myself I was sparing him the pain of conflict, the distress of creating awkwardness. But perhaps I was really sparing myself from having to acknowledge that I had been part of the problem all along, that I had sat on that committee and made decisions based on who seemed deserving, according to our narrow standards rather than who actually needed help." Mrs. Rowell turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Fenton kept records showing that I had voted to reduce allocations to the Marsh family, because Mrs. Marsh had been sharp with me about the Women's Institute accounts. He documented that I had supported increased distributions to the Fletcher family, not because they were more needy, but because they were more grateful, more willing to acknowledge our generosity publicly. He showed through his meticulous notes that my charity was not really about helping others, but about feeling good about myself." "That is a difficult truth to face," Miss Marple said with genuine sympathy. "Yes, and I cannot help but think that facing such truths year after year, while everyone around him praised themselves for their goodness, must have been unbearably lonely for him. He saw clearly what we all refused to see, and his reward for that clarity was isolation and eventual silence." Mrs. Rule returned to her chair, her composure partially restored by the relief of confession. "There is something else I must tell you, something I learned only yesterday. Mrs. Bell, Dr. Haydock's housekeeper, mentioned to me that after Mr. Fenton's death, when the doctor was examining the cottage, he found something peculiar in the garden shed where Mr. Fenton died." "What did he find?" Miss Marple inquired, her attention sharpening. "A letter, addressed to me, propped against the lantern on the shelf. The doctor gave it to me yesterday, saying he thought it must have been written just before Mr. Fenton's death, though why he had taken it to the shed rather than posting it, the doctor could not say." From her handbag, Mrs. Rowell withdrew an envelope, slightly crumpled, and passed it to Miss Marple. "I think you should read it. I believe it explains what happened that evening." Miss Marple opened the envelope carefully and withdrew a single sheet of paper covered in Mr. Fenton's neat handwriting. The letter was brief. "Dear Mrs. Rowell, I am writing to thank you for your many kindnesses over the years, and particularly for your visit this evening. Your concern for my welfare has always been genuine, and I would not wish you to think otherwise. However, I must confess that our conversation tonight has helped me reach a conclusion I've been avoiding for some time. You're right that no one wishes to hear uncomfortable truths during a time of celebration. But I have come to understand that no one wishes to hear them at any time, and that by remaining silent to spare others discomfort, I have been complicit in perpetuating injustices I was placed in a position to remedy. I have therefore decided to let my records speak for themselves when I am no longer here to complicate their message with my presence. I have documented everything carefully, and I have arranged for certain truths to be revealed after my death. I hope you will understand that this is not vindictiveness, but simply a desire to ensure that, eventually, the parish's charity will be administered according to need rather than favouritism. Please do not blame yourself for any of this. You have been kinder to me than most, and your advice this evening, though I cannot follow it, was offered with genuine concern for my well-being, but I find I can no longer bear the weight of knowing what I know and saying nothing about it. My heart, which has been weak for some time, seems to have reached its limit not through physical exertion, but through the exhausting effort of maintaining silence. If you find this letter, it will mean that my heart has indeed given out. I hope you will take some comfort in knowing that it did so peacefully, and that I face the end without fear, knowing that the truth I have documented will eventually do its work. With gratitude for your kindness and regret for the burden my honesty may place upon you, Leonard Fenton. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then carefully refolded it and returned it to Mrs. Rowell. For a long moment neither woman spoke. He went to the shed to write this letter, Mrs. Rowell finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, away from the house, away from comfort, to a place where he could be alone with his thoughts and his conscience. And while he was writing, or perhaps just after finishing, his heart failed. He died in the act of explaining himself, of trying to ensure I would understand that his choice was not a rejection of my kindness, but an embrace of a truth he could no longer ignore. He was a remarkable man, Miss Marple said softly. Yes, and I helped kill him by making him feel that his truth was unwelcome, that his honesty was an imposition, that his concerns were less important than our comfort. Mrs. Rowell wiped her eyes. The gratitude he expressed in that letter shames me more than any accusation could have done. He thanked me even as he explained how my kindness had failed him. Miss Marple set down her knitting and leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Rowell, gratitude that demands silence is not gratitude at all. True gratitude acknowledges the gift and honours the giver by using that gift well. Mr. Fenton gave the village years of honest service, and the village's gratitude should have been to listen when he spoke, to value his judgment, to trust that his concerns came from integrity rather than pettiness. Instead, the village's gratitude was conditional on his continued silence, his continued willingness to see injustice and say nothing about it. "What should I do now?" Mrs. Rowell asked. "You should honour his memory by ensuring that his truth does the work he intended it to do," Miss Marple replied. "You should make certain that the parish's charity is reformed, that distributions are made fairly, and that no one is ever again made to feel that honesty is less valuable than comfortable falsehood." After Mrs. Rowell departed, carrying Mr. Fenton's letter with her like a sacred charge, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting. The grey morning had given way to a greyer afternoon, and the light in her sitting room was soft and dim. She thought about gratitude, real and false, about the difference between appreciating someone's service and valuing their humanity, about how easy it was to praise the dead for virtues one had actively discouraged in the living. Mr. Fenton had died because his heart could no longer bear the burden of silent knowledge, but in a deeper sense he had died because the village had made it clear that his truth was unwelcome, that his integrity was inconvenient, that his concern for justice was less important than everyone else's comfort. And now that truth was emerging anyway, exactly as he had arranged, forcing those who had silenced him to face what they had preferred to ignore. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a kind of harvest after all. Chapter 10. After the sheaves were carried away, November arrived with its customary insistence, stripping the last leaves from the trees and bringing with it a quality of light that seemed to render everything in sharper relief, as though the world itself had decided that the time for soft focus had passed and clarity was now required. The harvest decorations had long since been removed from the church, the apples consumed, the flowers composted, the wheat sheaves distributed to those who kept chickens or appreciated their rustic charm. Life in St. Mary Mead had resumed its ordinary rhythms, or appeared to have done so to the casual observer. But Miss Marple, who was rarely a casual observer, noted certain changes that suggested the village had not emerged from recent events entirely unchanged. Mrs. Dacre, for instance, had resigned from the Charitable Distributions Committee, citing her many other responsibilities and suggesting, with uncharacteristic humility, that fresh perspectives might be beneficial. She'd been seen in conversation with the Marsh family, and though the details of that conversation had not been made public, young Tom Wilson reported that his mother had mentioned Mrs. Dacre's visit to the Marshes had been accompanied by a basket of provisions and what appeared to be a genuine apology for past oversights. The Reverend Hartley had announced, during Sunday service, that the parish's charitable distributions would henceforth be reviewed quarterly by an independent committee that would include representatives from recipient families as well as donors, ensuring that those who understood need from personal experience would have a voice in determining how assistance was provided. And Mrs. Rowell, though she had not resigned from the committee, had taken to visiting families personally before allocations were decided, asking quiet questions about circumstances and needs rather than relying on assumptions or appearances. These changes had been implemented without fanfare, without any public acknowledgement of what had prompted them. Mr. Fenton's name was not invoked, his concerns not explicitly referenced. The village had chosen to reform itself quietly, to correct course without dwelling on how it had strayed. Miss Marple, trimming her roses on a grey November afternoon, reflected on this approach with mixed feelings. There was something to be said for discretion, for allowing people to change without forcing them to publicly confess their failings. And yet there was also something troubling about the way Mr. Fenton's role in prompting these reforms had been quietly erased, his truth acknowledged in practice but not in word. She was interrupted in these reflections by the arrival of Miss Hartley, who had taken to calling more frequently since her brother's examination of Mr. Fenton's records had revealed so much about the quiet man's character. "I thought you might like to know," Miss Hartley said, accepting tea with a small sad smile, "that my brother has arranged for a memorial plaque to be placed in the church. For Mr. Fenton, it will read simply, 'Leonard Fenton, who served this parish faithfully and saw clearly what others prefer to overlook. May his honesty inspire our own.' My brother thought it important that his legacy be remembered accurately, not just comfortably." "That is very thoughtful," Miss Marple said, genuinely pleased. Mrs. Rowell suggested the wording. She said that Mr. Fenton had spent his life being thanked for things that were easy to acknowledge, while his real gifts went unrecognised, and that his memorial should honour what he actually gave rather than what we found convenient to receive. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their tea as the afternoon light filtered through the sitting-room windows. "I've been thinking about gratitude," Miss Hartley said eventually, "about how we expressed such elaborate thanks for Mr. Fenton's reliable service, his careful record-keeping, his willingness to handle tedious details. But we never thanked him for his integrity, his courage, his refusal to let comfort override conscience. We praised him for making things easy for us, not for making things right." "That is often the way," Miss Marple observed. "We are grateful for what serves us, less so for what challenges us." "Yes, and I think that's what killed him in the end. Not the failure of his heart alone, but the failure of our gratitude to be genuine. We wanted him to be useful, not truthful. And when he chose truth over usefulness, we made it clear that he was valued only for the former." Miss Hartley set down her cup with deliberate care. "Dr. Haydock told my brother something interesting. He said that hearts don't fail only from physical strain but from moral strain as well. That the effort of carrying burdens others refuse to acknowledge can be as exhausting as any physical labour, and that sometimes, when people reach the limit of what they can bear, their bodies simply stop trying." "A thoughtful observation," Miss Marple said. "The doctor said he'd seen it before, in people who spend years caring for difficult relatives, or workers who know their employer is engaged in dishonest practices, or anyone who must daily witness injustice they're powerless to remedy. Eventually the heart just gives up, not from lack of strength, but from exhaustion at the futility of continuing." After Miss Hartley departed, Miss Marple returned to her roses, though the light was fading and the work would soon become impossible. She thought about harvests, about what they revealed and what they concealed. The Harvest Festival had celebrated abundance, gratitude, community harmony. But beneath that celebration had been hidden the reality of selective generosity, conditional charity, and the silencing of inconvenient truth. Mr. Fenton's death had brought that reality to light, had forced the village to examine itself more honestly than it had been willing to do while he lived. His carefully kept records, his posthumous letters, his final message written in a cold garden shed, all had done the work he knew they would do, revealing patterns of favouritism and forcing reform. But the cost of that revelation had been his life, and Miss Marple could not help but think that the price had been unnecessarily high. If the village had been willing to listen when he was alive, if gratitude had extended to valuing his judgment rather than merely his service, if honesty had been welcomed rather than suppressed, then reform could have come without tragedy. The roses would bloom again next summer, she thought, trimming away the dead wood to encourage new growth. The harvest would come round again next autumn, and the church would fill once more with apples and wheat sheaves and expressions of thanksgiving. But perhaps, if Mr. Fenton's death had taught the village anything of value, that thanksgiving would be more genuine, more honest about both abundance and scarcity, more willing to acknowledge truth even when truth was uncomfortable. She had noticed during the past week that people spoke differently about charity now. There was less self-congratulation, more genuine inquiry into need. There was less certainty about who deserved help, and more humility about the limitations of outside judgment. There was, in short, the beginning of the kind of honest charity that Mr. Fenton had quietly practiced for years, while others had praised themselves for far less. As the light failed entirely and Miss Marple returned indoors, she reflected that tragedies often occurred not from cruelty, but from the careful avoidance of discomfort. Mr. Fenton had died because an entire community had found it easier to silence one honest man than to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. And while that community was now facing those truths and making amends, the fact remained that such amends had come too late for the one person who had most deserved to see them. The harvest had been gathered, the sheaves carried away, the decorations removed. But what remained, what would continue to remain long after this particular autumn had faded into memory, was the knowledge that gratitude